Sometimes I can't. There we go. See? It works. Good morning, everyone. We are going to be continuing our study on post-exilic Judea and the canon and all the things that we don't normally study or learn about. But before we do that, any prayers, we'll pray. Any prayers, any requests? I am scheduled to have a heart procedure. We've got it scheduled for March 4th. So I had a heart stent about 10 years ago, and it's time to get a new one, I guess. So the warranty's wearing out, so. $6 million man, I'm like the 60-cent guy. So, All right, so let's bow our heads and give praise to our God. Holy Father, we come before you. We thank you for this beautiful day. We thank you for the weather, the melting snow and the warming sun, knowing that spring is around the corner just as you've ordained. We lift you up in glory and give you honor and praise that is rightly due to you for all things. There are many here who have prayers, who have thoughts and requests that are in their hearts and their minds. We just lift them up and continue to ask for Brother Kevin and his family and Cindy and all those that are praying for him, the doctors and the rehab people. Lord, there's many who are here who are suffering, either not physically, but mentally or financially or whatever it is. We just ask that your peace flood them as only your peace can. We thank you for your son and his act of his selfless act for us and for all those that we love. We give you praise and glory again, and we thank you for your word. Help us to be mindful of those things you've put before us to learn and to understand. Pray this all through Christ's holy name. Amen. All right, so real quick, we're just going to kind of cover, review specifically, or kind of just summarize what we talked about last week. We are talking, moving into the writings, which is really where we get our historical data. For those of you who, for almost 1,800, 1,900 years, majority of the world took the Bible's historical narrative at face value and as just a straightforward narrative. But as we've discussed, there's some, not discrepancies, but there's stuff that's missing. Because again, we're only getting one perspective, the perspective of the person who is writing. And it is God ordained because it's important. But there's also other things that happen. And a lot of what we learn comes from these writings. Almost everything we learn. Again, unless you're into archaeology and you study, soil patterns and pottery shards and old buildings and so forth. This is what the majority of people, how they understand history. So, we talked about the different canonical books in the different sects. Started with the Jewish canon, which contains all of our Protestant books as well, but they're just in a slightly different order. And again, for the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites, The most important are the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Not that anything else is not important, but that is the basis of the law. That is where their entire society, their entire persona comes out of. Everything else builds on those 5 books, on the law itself. Talked about the 39 books in our most understood canon, the Protestant canon. And then we discussed the 3 major branches of Christianity. There are multiple that are not considered Protestant, but they're not Orthodox or Catholic, such as Marianites, which are a form of Catholicism. You have the Assyrian Church of the East, which are, you have the Egyptian Coptic churches. Those are not necessarily Orthodox or Catholic. You have the Eritrean and the Ethiopian churches. Those are completely, I'm sure it's falling apart. Those are, they have a completely different, not a completely different, but they have a different canon order. I will note, and I didn't include this in here, and maybe I will, down the road a little bit. I do want to show everybody what the Eritrean or the Ethiopian Bible looks like, because it contains all of the Apocrypha that we have and more. It is if you know nothing about Ethiopians, they are fiercely Christian in their belief. They also have, which I find amazing, they have the longest fasts of any of the major denominations, major organizations in Christianity. They fast approximately 240 days a year, which is more than half of a typical calendar. So they have some form of fast. Now, it's not a complete fast. It may be fasting from certain foods or whatever, but they do they fast twice a day. They fast as we find in the Didache. They fast on Wednesdays and on Fridays. It's really interesting. But anyway, here's the Catholic and Orthodox and Protestant books in various orders. And this is just going through the different orders. This is just the timeline of the prophets. That just kind of was there to take up space. We're just talking about the compositional order. How did these things come about? How did we order the Old Testament? Because again, the focus of this class is Old Testament. And as we discussed, and I have some notes here, the Old Testament comes together over 1,000 years. So roughly 1,000 years to get all 39 books that we have, plus the Apocrypha, if you're Catholic or Orthodox, together. The New Testament comes together about approximately 150 years. Okay, everything gets combined or whatever, depending on your position on the drafting of those books or letters. But again, because the composition of the Old Testament took so much longer, there was more time for things to get modified, misspelled, written down, copied wrong, because again, if we are writing these on papyri or on animal skins, it's not, there's not 4, 5, 10,000 people who are all making these copies. It's one guy, and he's probably the only person who can write in the village, write decently, and he's writing these books. We're copying these manuscripts. A lot of these are traditions written down from oral tradition, because again, before we had writing, these messages were passed down. And I mean, in the modern era, we see that in Native American, societies. They didn't have writing, at least in North America, the US, they didn't really have extensive writing culture. Most of their traditions are oral. You know, it's very rare you get, you know, some of the larger tribes and societies in Central America that do start developing writing. But again, it's pictographic. We're not talking about letters and numbers. We're talking about pictures, hieroglyphs. So it takes a long time for this Old Testament to come together as compared to a much more robust writing culture that you have in the New Testament. So I put this up here because I want everybody to see that, yes, there are 4 temples, there are 4 sanctuaries, the tent of meeting, Solomon's temple, Nehemiah's temple, the second temple, or Zerubbabel's temple, and then you have the Herod's temple. Most people, when they think of the second temple, they think of the picture of Herod's temple, but Herod's temple is actually a third temple. And then I also included, and I talked about that, if you see at the very bottom, beneath Herod's temple, which is up top right, that drawing right underneath it to the left a little bit. I know it's a really bad drawing or scale, but that's actually the Elephantine temple that was found in Ethiopia or Egypt. So that's a drawing, a rendering of it. Again, it's not the temple, but it's called the Elephantine temple because Elephantine was the name of a suburb outside of Alexandria. So how do we get our writing? Like we talked about, oral transmission, communication culture. This is where you get the stories. We like to think, for example, in the New Testament, we like to think that Matthew was writing contemporaneously with Jesus' words, but we don't have any, scientifically, we don't have any evidence of that, okay? The evidence we do have is that it was written, that the stories were written from oral culture, from oral transmission, stories that were passed on. Hey, did you hear about Jesus? Or, hey, did you hear about Josiah? Did you hear about King Herod? Did you hear about this or that? And that's where these stories come from. And again, we see that in an example, I guess it's a presumption of mine, in Nehemiah when I was, like I read last week, when he's transmitting, when he's speaking about the law to the people. He's reading from the scrolls, because again, even though the Bible, the translation we have says books, there are no books at this point in Old Testament time. Books are a later creation in the common era. But he's reading from scrolls. Majority of the people who are listening to him know about it, know about the law, and that's why they say, tell us, read to us the law. But they had never heard it before. Why? Because they're not reading. They can't read. They have very limited reading skills. Even if they were to read, I mean, we have a tough time sometimes reading the law, reading, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, because part of it is it's dry. It's the law. I mean, to them, to us, it is a religious aspect. We have that emphasis that it is religion that they are reading. To them, it's not just religion. It is lifestyle. It is their entire life. These prohibitions and these exorcisms, or not excursions, or these emphasis that you need to do these things, that's your life. That's just like when we read, don't speed. Speed limit 35 and you're going 40. Well, you're breaking the law. The same thing to them. These are daily, this is everything that they need to learn how to live. But they haven't read it. It's not read to them on a regular basis. And for 80 years during that exile, they didn't hear it. So majority of this is oral tradition. And even if you read it, even if you can read it, you're generally reading it to other people who can't read. And in that way, it is oral tradition, because I'm reading something that you can't read. So if I brought a book, I don't know how many of you speak Spanish or read Spanish, but if I start reading in Spanish, you're probably going to have a hard time, majority have a hard time understanding it. But if I translate it to you, then you are understanding, but you're not reading it, you're getting it orally. And then you can pass those stories on to other people. That's how that goes. Over 1,000 years. So we're talking, it's a lot more complicated than we ever give it thought to, that I ever give it thought to, you know. There's some guy in the middle of nowhere in a little room, no electricity. He might have an oil candle, or he may just be sitting next to a door, or he may be outside, and he's either writing or trying to write these things down.
I just thought of a little analogy, you know, the old game telephone. You know, you'd sit around and one person says something, you wonder what happens when it gets back to you.
Yep.
In other words, this is complicated.
It is. It's much
not simplistic. It's not,
yeah.
oh, well, it was just all.
Right.
You know,
And there is, that's not to diminish that these things are changed. A great Dr. Metzger, if anybody's ever heard of Dr. Metzger, he's a renowned, he's passed away, but renowned textual critic, New Testament textual critic. But these traditions, the emphasis is, and he helped, he was part of the organizations that developed Zondervan, the Bible societies. To put these things together, to translate them from Greek or Hebrew. About at least 30% of the New Testament has some sort of Scrivener error. Doesn't mean that it's errored. It means that somebody misspelled something. So maybe instead of Judas, it was Jonah. Or Joshua is Josiah. Those kinds of things. It's not or instead of he went there, he goes there. That's 99% of any error that you hear about in popular culture. That's what it is. It's not, it doesn't change the meaning, doesn't change the intent. It's just we're all human beings, and we all make mistakes. Because again, we're talking about it's not limited education. It's a limit in the ability to do the things that we take for granted. We have all the luxury of being able to go to school and so forth. And they didn't really have school. So you're either you want to go to school, or do you want to help bring in the harvest, or, plant or take care of the animals to survive? Those were the decisions these people made, and that's a simplistic analysis of it. But the emphasis was not that we don't want you to be educated. The emphasis is we need you to help us work. Those of you who I don't know if there's anybody who was formerly of the Catholic faith, but again, I study all this information and I find it interesting for myself. But for the longest time, for almost 2,000 years, a Catholic priest, and in fact it still happens in the Orthodox faith, in many of the majority major denominations, the priest does not face the people. He faces towards the altar with the people. And he reads the book. Because the priest was one of the few people who could read. The people who came in were hearing the word. Because they couldn't read it. That's how they got their information. So, again, the oral transmission, the communication culture is so important. So, the other thing being that they didn't have typewriters, copy machines, printers, or anything like that. You're writing by hand. Y'all remember the big red Indian books? Imagine filling those out and writing the entire New Testament or the Old Testament. Give you Isaiah, and as we, or give you one of the major prophets. It takes a good while.
And kind of along those lines, as you dig into it, the people are making copies, as we point out. Well, it was even recognized in those days, and it wasn't necessarily just with biblical text, that there was acknowledged this is a lot better copy than that one.
Mm-hmm.
And so depending on which copy they got that they're copying, in addition to the competence of the person doing the copying, it was very interesting.
Right. Right. So the best evidence that we have, the best physical evidence that we have, again, and we talked about this last week, is manuscript evidence. And we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran documents. Those are the oldest copies of the Old Testament that we have. They date to 250 BCE to 100 CE. So, 2,000 years. The next oldest are Greek translations of the Old Testament from the 4th century, and those are attached to the codices and the some of the documents that are Christian documents. So some of the world famous, the oldest New Testaments have attachments, have Old Testament portions to them. After that, we're looking at the Leningrad Codex, which is the oldest complete Hebrew text that we have. The next oldest Hebrew text, which is from 1000 CE. And as we talked about last week, the Old Testament for the Hebrews, for the Jews, did not become compiled and organized and solidified until about 400, around in the 400s CE. We're talking after the demise of the temple. Now, that being said, when I say that, we need to understand that the volume or what was considered fundamental was always the Torah. It's just like last week when I briefly spoke about the one thing that distinguishes Jews from any other society, and the one thing that has remained constant, because the temple practice has changed. We go from the ark to no ark, to from the desert tent to physical building to no building, the synagogue, rabbis, is circumcision. Circumcision has always remained. It is the one constant of Judaism. It has never changed. So we have that. The other thing that has never changed, at least since the compilation of documents that we have, is that the Torah has always been fundamental. The first 5 books of the Bible. So, manuscript evidence, it's just hard because, again, paper deteriorates, especially when we're talking about animal skins and papyri. It's much more fragile. We talked about the compositional order, so traditional dating, and I think this is kind of where I left off. We're talking about the traditional belief of when these books were put together. So around 1500, 1400 BCE, we have the first portions of the Torah, or we actually have the Torah, and then we have the prophets, the writings of Samuel, and then we have the Psalms, then the wisdom writings, the major prophets and the history, and then you have some of the minor prophets, and you have Isaiah right before the exile, and then you have some other minor prophets warning Judah of the incoming doom, and then we have Ruth, which is a history, and then you have Jeremiah, Lamentations right before the exile, or right at the exile, and then you have Ezekiel and Daniel. This is traditionally what most denominations would say is a historic order of the composition. Compositional order, traditional dating, so continuing this, you got post-exile, which is what we're studying. So the books would be Haggai and Zechariah in the 520s, right after the return. And then you have Malachi in the late 400s. And then you have the writings of the Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. Again, writing, and we'll talk about this, it's the chronicler is right, the writer of Chronicles writes to remind them of their history, and then but sometime before 400 you have some of the smaller prophets and their writings. So current scholarly consensus. I know this is a lot of information. That's Deborah's victory dance. It's part of the book, but there's no such thing as consensus in academia, because the whole point is to argue. So you can have majority scholarly consensus. That means roughly 60% of the people agree to some extent. At any moment, it changes. So scholarly consensus is because writing does not really develop in the Levant until around 800. You get pre-monarchic fragments, and I will say that the scholarly consensus of these first sections, so before 750, is fairly new, but has been debated, but at this time, at least as far as my research can find, the oldest section of the Bible that they can date is the pre-monarchic Song of the Sea, which is Exodus 15, which I am going to read. Exodus 15, 1 through 18. Now, why is that? Well, if you look at the Old Testament, you'll see a lot of sections, at least in my Bible, where you have the poetry. And you can kind of identify a poetry section in your Bible, right? So, I don't know if you can see this, but so you have this section of the Bible where it's just 2 columns. It's pretty straightforward. You know that's a reading portion. This is a poem because it's broken down into pentameter or two. I don't know anything about poetry. The only thing I know is Carpe Diem. Dead Poets Society. So, but the poetry sections are always broken down. And if you look like in Jeremiah, there's a bunch of sections of Jeremiah that are poetry. They understand the way it's broken out that way in our books, but poetry always appears to be older than or something that's included in those writings. If you look in the New Testament, there's some poetry language that most New Testament scholars will say that are the first announcements of belief, doctrinal, poetry, and it's in a poetry language. There was Jesus. He was born of a virgin, lived a life, went to the cross, died, resurrected. That's fundamental. Those fundamental things are considered poetry. This Song of Moses, or the Song of the Sea, is poetic in its language, and then they consider this the oldest section of the Old Testament, the Song of Moses. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. His elite officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent out your fury. It consumed them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your steadfast love, you led the people whom you redeemed. You guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples heard, they trembled. Pangs seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed. Trembling seized the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan melted away. Terror and dread fell upon them. By the might of your arm, they became still as a stone, until your people, O Lord, passed by, until the people whom you acquired passed by them. You brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your own possession, the place, O Lord, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, that your hands have established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. So, scholars believe that this is the oldest fragment, one of the oldest fragments of the Old Testament. If you would think about it, we're talking about they have crossed the Red Sea. The poetry praises the Lord for his might and for his ability to destroy the Egyptians who are pursuing them. But it also mentions people that they haven't encountered yet. The Philistines, the Edomites, the Canaanites. And again, the story spread to these people. And yes, they probably were afraid. But scholars will say that you're identifying people that they had not encountered yet. So it indicates to them that this was written post that it happened. But not necessarily. It wasn't written contemporaneously at the time that it occurred. That doesn't mean that it wasn't ordained or written that way, or for some malfeasance or some evil purpose. It's just, that's the way it's written. There's, I will share this, and if you go online, you can see this slide and read it. But Psalm 29 is probably the oldest psalm that we have. I'm not going to read it, but I just wanted to read that one. The Song of Deborah, so Deborah's victory in Judges 5. The Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32:143. These are all poetic sections of these books that scholars have identified as, okay, these were probably written before, or at least orally transmitted before the composition of these books. And because they were probably, that's how you tell a story, at least back then. You tell it in poetic form, or you say it in a way that people can remember it. To be or not to be, that is the question. We remember that because it's part of art, it's part of poetry, it's part of stuff that you repeat. It's easy to repeat. There's a pattern in that line that makes it memorable. Same thing with these languages or these words. Then we're talking about the 740s, 700. You got Amos. You got the first 39 books of Isaiah. And we'll talk about this briefly. Isaiah is actually two writers. There's a scholarly consensus that there are two writers of Isaiah. The first 39 are written by one. The last 21, roughly, are written by another writer. I don't have enough information to go beyond that at this point. Hosea and Micah are written around that time. Then you have in the late 600s, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomistic history. It's going to get that messed up. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And then another portion of Deuteronomy 5 through 26. Late 600s, again, you have Nahum written in a separate area. Then the early 500s, Obadiah, the first section of Deuteronomy and the last section of Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the latter half of Isaiah, and the composition of the Psalms. It's not that the Psalms were not orally transmitted or there weren't portions of it before, but compiled roughly at the return, post-exile.
I think you touched on something that's important to note. On a lot of the debates on when something was compiled, a lot of the debates will go into things like the language used and the style of just, how you tell something. In certain cases, the debate centers solely, because they don't have other evidence, on the material itself. Daniel's a good example of this. That's highly debated because for it to be produced in the traditional timeline, it had to be prophetic. It was too accurate.
Right.
But that's their only evidence for saying it had to come later. That's the centerpiece. And so whichever bias you have is how you're going to date it. That they just can't accept the contemporaneous dating because they would have to admit a supernatural inspiration.
And that is the primary difference between traditional dating and scholarly dating, or modern consensus dating. And again, this is just based on scholars, and you hit it on the head. Scholars cannot presuppose anything supernatural, which is why you have a different timeline, okay? It doesn't mean that they're right, but it also doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means what it means. If you take it from the analysis of what evidence, physical evidence, do we have, then you have certain dating. For example, Daniel. The traditional dating is Daniel is pre-exile because he talks about all the things that are going to come. The scholarly modern consensus is Daniel is written in the early, so between 150 and 250 BCE. Because post-exile, post certain things that do happen post-exile that could not be explained in a scientific, non-supernatural basis. So, but that's exactly the evidence we have. Because as I said earlier, the oldest documents we have are Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so physically, the oldest paper, and when I say paper, papyrus, the oldest writings we have are 250 BCE. And as I showed you a couple months ago, there's writing in stone, but it's not whole books. It's just word. It's like a single word. Adonai, Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton. That's it. That's the only word we have. It's not a book. It's not even a full sentence. It's just words or letters that look very similar to Hebrew letters, which also look like Akkadian or, any other number of writings in that area. I mean, if you read a book in Spanish, you can see the letters. Maybe not all the letters look right. Maybe they have a little accent mark or whatever, but they're the same letters. It's the same thing here, 3,000 years ago. It's the same letters that your neighbor 500 miles to the west or 500 miles to the east used, just with a little different squiggly line on it or something. So it's hard to make that out. But again, because we're talking about stuff that we can physically identify, and we're trying to identify things that are there, but we have not traditionally studied. We're going to talk about the scholarly consensus. We understand by faith. We understand the supernatural. We understand that God is in control in all these things. But we also need to know, and I'm not doubting God, believe me. If God's in control, why didn't we include Maccabees? Why don't we study that on a regular basis? The Orthodox do because it's in their Bible. I'm not saying that they're wrong, we're right, or we're right, or we're wrong and they're right, or anything like that, or that God doesn't want us to study, or he does want us to study. What I'm saying are those are questions that pop up in everybody's head. Maybe not that specific question, but in everybody's head. Everybody has a question like that. So, get off my high horse, my low horse. Continuing this. So we have the Torah compiled. Doesn't mean we didn't have these stories. And doesn't mean that we didn't have portions of them, because we talked about just a second ago, this last couple lines, parts of Deuteronomy are written beforehand. Parts of Exodus are put together. But at the return, we get the Torah put together. And then we get the last section of Isaiah written and compiled and put together. Have a couple of other minor prophets, Haggai, Zephaniah, Malachi, Joel. We get the Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. I personally don't agree with specifically that one, because those books are the books that I've really kind of studied for this. I think we're probably about 100, maybe 75 years too late on Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, but that's just me, an uneducated goober. You have Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Jonah. If anybody has studied the ancient cultures, the story of Job is not unique to the Hebrew Bible or to the Christian canon. That general story has been circulating throughout the Near East for centuries before it was written down. There is history of that Akkadian Zoroastrianism has a version of Job, which to me says that it happened, and somebody knew about it and wrote it down. And then you get, really, after that, you get into a lot of the Apocrypha, and we're going to quit here real quick. Tobit, Sirach, Daniel, 1st Maccabees, Judith, and 2nd Maccabees. And then we'll talk about the Apocrypha later. But this is a picture of the Second Temple, or it's a rendering, drawing of the Second Temple. As you can see, there's sections of it that just look a little bit different than our traditional view of it. Whether that actually was it or what it really looked like, I won't know until it's my time. So, any questions? A lot of information. Thank you for your time.